Do you know about the different types of euthanasia?
No.
No, not really.
I do know a bit about the different types of euthanasia, but I can't really tell the difference between the two.
No.
No, I don't. Do you know the different types of euthanasia?
No, I don't think I do. I just thought it was more of like a collective thing, like an idea that euthanasia allows you the right to die, but I didn't know there was different types.
No, I don't know any other types. No, I don't. Is it like voluntary and involuntary?
I know about voluntary and involuntary euthanasia.
I only really know about lethal injections, and nothing else really comes to mind now.
I understand that morphine, you could be given morphine by a doctor to end your life, and I think it's an injection you can have when you go into Europe, some parts of Europe, but I don't know any others.
Well, roughly speaking, you'd have, I believe, involuntary euthanasia where someone will be terminally ill and unable to communicate their wish to live or not, and the decision would need to be made to continue their life or not. An alternative one might be a voluntary euthanasia where someone would actually wish to end their life.
I'm not really too sure, but is one assisted and one is like, they do it themselves?
Not necessarily, no. I don't know it in depth because I haven't been explained, like the media doesn't really explain it in depth, I don't think.
There are many different ways that a person can perform the act of euthanasia. These methods are called active euthanasia, where a person deliberately intervenes to end someone's life, for example by injecting them with a large dose of sedatives. Passive euthanasia, where a person causes death by withholding or withdrawing treatment that is necessary to maintain life, such as withholding antibiotics for someone with pneumonia. There are more forms of euthanasia created by the person who is having it done to them. These are voluntary euthanasia, where a person makes a conscious decision to die and asks help to do this. And then there is non-voluntary euthanasia, where a person is unable to give their consent, for example they are in a coma or severely brain damaged, and another person can make the decision on their behalf, often because the person has previously expressed their wish for their life to be ended in such circumstances. And finally, there is involuntary euthanasia, where a person is killed against their expressed wishes, which isn't often seen. In Oregon, where euthanasia is legal, 82% of the general public, 79% of religious people, 86% of disabled support it for the terminally ill, which are relatively high numbers. British doctors help nearly 20,000 people die a year, despite euthanasia being unlawful where they are based. The law made in 1961, called the Suicide Act, treats euthanasia as murder, and shows how strongly some people feel about the subject, to risk their lives for another.
What's your specific viewpoint on euthanasia and whether it should be legalised or not?
I think it's a complex issue. I think in reality decisions are made in hospitals and care homes and so on where there's a kind of a common sense decision is made at a certain point. So I think in practice probably more goes on is actually acknowledged. In terms of whether it's a sort of morally right thing to do or not, I think each case has to be looked at individually. But in principle, I don't disagree with either.
I mean, if they have a chance of survival, like a minuscule chance.
Totally agree with it.
I think that it depends on the person and what kind of a condition they're in. For instance, if they have like an illness, a terminal illness, and they would like to escape it, then probably yes.
I think that people should have the right to choose, like if they're in pain, then they have the right to choose if they want to die or not, so I'm for it.
I feel people should be allowed to end their own lives with explicit consent only, as long as it's for their own benefit, I'd say, like to end some kind of suffering from a sickness or an illness or anything like that.
Yeah, I think it's like it should be legal, it should be allowed. So if someone wants to die, then they should be allowed to.
Like in what sense?
Like if they're like terminally ill and they can't do it themselves, I think that they should be allowed to have the choice. But also, if they just want to do it themselves, they should be allowed.
What's your specific viewpoint on the legalisation of euthanasia?
I think that it should be legalised and it's a good thing, allowing people the right to die. It's their life and it allows people to die with dignity, and if people are suffering, they're not really getting a good quality of life and they're just living in pain. I don't think that's right. So yeah, I do agree with it.
I think in certain circumstances it's fine. So like, if someone's like an animal's really, really unwell and like they won't survive anyway, I think it might be the best way. But if it's going to be used in like really stupid ways, then I think it should be.
Do you think it should?
I believe that people who choose to be euthanized, they should be allowed to make that decision themselves. They shouldn't feel pressure like from people like the church and doctors and things. Like, they should be able to make that choice themselves.
I feel that if people well and truly want to die because they're not happy with their life, like let's say they're terminally ill or something, I think they should be allowed to die by euthanasia, whereas those that are just bored shouldn't be allowed to. So only specific people should be allowed to have euthanasia.
Personally, I feel like in terms of like it varies. Suicide, I think people like with mental health illness, they maybe should have the option to like have more consultations and have more therapy options instead of like just being assisted suicide. And maybe people with like really terminal illnesses, like if they're really in pain or they feel like they need to be put down, like, and they can't really help how they're feeling, I feel like that should be an option for them personally.
They should be at least given a chance, because say if they are in a coma, like you don't know what's going on inside their head, and they could be trying their best to survive, and say there's like such an odd chance that they could like put someone down, and then say if they didn't get put down the next day, they could have woken up. So I think they should be given a chance.
We asked the students and staff at Thomas Tallis School what they thought of euthanasia.
I'm a media teacher.
I am considered religious.
I'm a psychologist and energy healer.
I'm a Christian.
And so I teach a timetable of lower school and upper school. To ensure the safety and well-being and mental health of anybody that I see, and to make sure that I keep client confidentiality at all times. In certain circumstances, I'd say I agree with it.
Personally, I don't think people should have the right to die.
If they're suffering and they want to end their pain, then they should have that right. I believe they should.
And then in other circumstances, I don't really agree with it. Yes, sometimes, but I don't think it's a simple yes or no answer, so I really can't say yes or no to that one.
I feel like I agree with it.
I think actually it's the person's choice whether they should have the right to die.
If they're suffering and they want to end their pain, then they should have that right. I believe they should.
I think in that case, I would say it's acceptable.
It's kind of a grey area. I do believe that not most people, but me personally, if I was suffering in pain, I wouldn't want to be just living my life being in pain. And
Well, people will disagree, mainly because of the church and because of religion.
Yeah, I can understand why certain religions would disagree with it.
I mean, not only in Christianity, I think in other religions as well.
I don't think it's just down to religions. I think that's to do with people's opinion, not just their religious beliefs. I've got two really religious friends, and they are absolutely morally against euthanasia of all kinds. In their eyes, it's a sin, and it's against what God thinks for them.
Well, in the Bible, it says that how all sins are, in God's eyes, are of an equal. They're all equally severe.
I think they're all the same, according to the Bible.
But I would say, from my opinion, that some of the worst ones are worshipping false gods and murder.
some religions, no specific religions, but I know some religions do believe that only their like higher being, deity, God, whatever, they believe that only it or them, he, she can only take a life, and it's their decision.
Because they believe that only God can choose whether to give or take a life and that sort of thing. I think there's more to it than that, but the reason that people think that euthanasia is okay, I think, is just because if the person is suffering and if they're in really immense pain, then they should have that right to end their suffering if they choose to.
I think in that case, I would say it's acceptable.
I feel like not a lot of people have had to, like, I don't feel like a lot of people have experienced it, especially at my age, because that would be kind of left up to the parent. Like, if it was an older relative, it would usually be your, like, kind of parents and other elder family members who would make that decision.
You know, it was really interesting actually. My dad is really unwell. He's got quite severe Alzheimer's now. And as a kid, I remember having more than once having this chat with him about whether if he ever lost his mind, he said to just shoot him in the head, which was a bit of a joke when we were growing up. And I never would have thought anything like that happened. And then he started to become ill, and it wasn't until much later when his illness had progressed that I actually thought back at that time where he said what he said, and in some ways, you know, I have this bit of guilt because I feel like actually would he want to still be here living with this condition where he is not himself anymore? And my answer is probably no. But would I want to take that decision to kind of end his life? I don't think I could morally unless he kind of made the decision for himself. So yes, it has made me question what is right and wrong. It's certainly in that case where it's very emotional, but I still think actually I don't think I would take away someone's life unless it was their choice to do it. If he had said to me before the illness got really bad, you know, I need you to take me away and go with me to be, you know, maybe I would have considered it, but he never asked me as an option at that point. But it is something I do think about even to this day, and probably will do for the rest of my life, because I do feel a bit guilty about that, about the fact that he's having to live with this condition and he may not necessarily have wanted to do that.
People need to understand why people in the church, religious people, may say, look, euthanasia it's not right. Like, we as human beings don't get to make that decision. But then if they also look at the people who are religious who say, yeah, no, euthanasia, that's okay. Yeah, so if they look at it from both points of view, it may change the way people feel about euthanasia.
I think there should be a system where people can appeal to the courts of law, which they do have that in very brief kind of cases, but I think that it should be more open for people to do that. So maybe appeal to the courts to say, you know, I want to terminate my life. And then go around about it the right way and legally. I think if it was, if everything was kind of legal, then you would have all these kind of grey areas of people, you know, people would misuse the system. So I do think it would never be legal because of that, because of those grey areas. But I think it should be more accessible for people to be able to end their life, should they need to, given the right circumstance. In general, that as with everything, if you make it legal, eventually it's open to abuse by certain people. That's probably the shortest answer I can give, yes. I do kind of understand why it's not made legal in that sense in the UK, because of that reason.